welcome everyone from around the world, even in these difficult times. 2, can the U.S. still promote democracy in the MENA region? A discussion about American exceptionalism and the global democracy project. This event is organized by the UCLA Center for Middle East Development and co-sponsored at UCLA by the Berkel Center for International Relations and the Luskin School of Public Policy. And now we have a very important event planned for you today, moderated by a significant CMED activist. They were popular and highly respected, Hafsa Halawa. Hafsa?
Thank you very much, Steve, for the introduction. Thank you to CMED for the invitation to join everyone today and to moderate this exciting discussion with this incredibly esteemed panel, which needs no introduction. I will introduce everybody. Firstly, I'd like to give a nod and a thank you to colleagues and friends who have helped in organizing this event from the very beginning of its inception. Ambassador Charlotta Spare, the director of the Swedish Dialogue Institute and a veteran diplomat of the Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and Abdulwahab Kipsi, the managing director of SIPE, the Center for International Private Enterprise. And very quickly to introduce our panelists before we jump right in to this discussion. We've got a lot to discuss and debate today. Firstly, I'd like to give a mention to one speaker who is unable to join us this afternoon. Robin Wright is unfortunately has been taken ill and will not be joining us today. But we do still have a phenomenally great panel to join us. Tom Carruthers, the interim president currently at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, D.C. Michael Hanna, who has recently been appointed the director of the US program at International Crisis Group, based in New York City, and Maya Jbeli joining us from Beirut, most recently appointed the MENA correspondent at Thomson Reuters Foundation. Thank you to all three of you and welcome to today's discussion. We're going to have quite an interactive discussion, lots of sort of back and forth. Rather than have speaker presentations on the issues, we've created a sort of format of a quick fire kind of Q&A between myself and the speakers. We will open it up after about 45 minutes for your questions and invite you to provide your questions and comments to the panel on this very timely issue. Obviously, we're in a, over the last couple of weeks, but certainly in the last few months, we're in a very interesting time, both for US domestic and foreign policy, but also in the MENA region itself. A lot of the discussions have been talking about sort of reestablishing new kinds of or new forms of diplomatic channels with old adversaries, but also a lot of more of the same from the MENA region. And I guess in light, for us at least, the thinking behind this topic and this discussion is that in light of not only domestic events in the United States over the last 6 or so months, but also the last 5 or so years and beyond, with the kind of the administration that we've seen under former President Donald Trump, the questions surrounding, and we'll go into these issues that surrounded the November elections and also the events of January 2021, but also very real-time events that are going on in the Middle East and US intervention and diplomatic efforts as well. But to take us a little bit of a step back, not insulting anyone's intelligence, but just for us, for those of us who aren't American, all of our panelists are Americans. So for those of us like myself who aren't and don't necessarily fully understand the concept, I'd like to invite Tom Carruthers to very briefly just give us an idea of the roots and the basis of American exceptionalism itself. So Tom, the floor is yours for a couple of minutes. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Hafsa. It's wonderful to be with you. I'm happy to talk a bit about American exceptionalism, but I'd like to say that I'm not endorsing the idea. Many people around the world find it an offensive idea, and I can understand that. And so I'd like to say that I'm not here to defend it, but I'm happy to try to explain it. American exceptionalism started very early in American political culture, all the way back to the American Revolution. The Americans at the time had the idea that America was being created as a kind of new country on the basis of principles, not on the basis of language or on the basis of religion or basis of ethnicity, but on the basis of principles. And so this idea that America was founded as a democratic republic on the basis of principles was exceptionalist. And then secondly, that it was an immigrant country. There was the mythical idea, and actually quite an offensive idea, that this was a, quote, empty land. Of course, it wasn't empty. It was full of Native Americans who were horrendously treated, but an empty land in which European immigrants and then immigrants later from other parts of the world settled. So exceptionalism goes all the way back to the roots of America's thinking about itself as how it was founded as a country, and then it evolved over time to take on, for example, the idea it's the most economically developed country in the world. For a while, it was the wealthiest country in the world and the dominant economy. So this was added on to this political culture conception.
Thanks, Tom. And sort of following up on that, to what extent does this idea, these principles, contribute to U.S. foreign policy making? You talked about America, the US, becoming the wealthiest nation, economic powerhouse. But in terms of the world superpower, sometimes called the world's policeman, and this idea of the exporting of norms and even the which we'll get onto as well, the democracy promotion agenda, how much of that is rooted in the concept of American exceptionalism? And
quite a bit. I mean, a key turning point was at the end of World War I, when the United States having entered the European War for the first time, the United States fighting a war in Europe. At the end of World War I, of course, President Woodrow Wilson articulated a vision of a world which is a post-colonial world, and that the United States would stand for the breaking up of empires and for every sort of nationality becoming its own nation state and having freedom. And so the United States saw itself as a transformative agent in a world ripped apart by World War I that was trying to put itself back together. Then after World War II, the United States, through the creation of the United Nations system, saw itself as the founder, the handmaiden of a new international liberal order rooted in international law that would project these liberal values around the world based on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and other such international agreements. So very much US foreign policy had this sort of founding ideas in the 20th century based in the idea that America is an exceptional country, not a colonial power, although later it came to take on forms of neo-colonial power, but its original conception was very exceptionalist of its role.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And just sort of, again, coming back to this idea, we call it, or at least, certainly in the development space, we call it the democracy promotion agenda, and this kind of idea of these norms, these values that America promotes abroad. And you've mentioned sort of the inception of that coming out of the world wars. But how, I guess I would ask, how does American exceptionalism kind of contribute to because there's been a question of whether or not that agenda is the right agenda, foreign policy in terms of, putting aside, we'll come back to the question of whether America has succeeded in implementing that policy, but whether or not it's the right agenda. Are there other elements that contribute to that, or is it solely rooted in this post-colonial, post-World War vision that you mentioned?
Well, the Cold War was, of course, a defining struggle for U.S. foreign policy and for the world. And the United States framed it as a struggle between a, quote, a free world and then the Soviet-controlled world. Of course, it wasn't purely a free world. There were many dictatorships in the free world. But nevertheless, the United States' conception of the free world as it presented it to itself and to others was a battle between freedom and tyranny. And so it took the World War II experience in the framework of the international liberal order and then sort of rolled into the Cold War and kept the idea that the United States was a values actor. It was not simply a geostrategic actor, but a geostrategic actor rooted in certain values. And then when the post-Cold War period emerged, when the Soviet Union collapsed, there was the idea that now this will be the moment, the freedom side beat the tyranny side. Now there will be an expansion of democracy globally. The United States will help this advance. And so this will be the final phase kind of US foreign policy. Will be trying to usher in a democratic 21st century in which democracy will be the dominant value. So you see the progression from World War I to World War II to the Cold War and then the post-Cold War period, this idea rolling like a carpet in the US view, out into the world, sort of a path for the world and a path for the United States and the world. Now, many mythical ideas in there, many contradictions, a lot of hypocrisy. We can come to that, but I'm just trying to say these are the founding myths and sort of the founding ideas in a way that have animated a lot of American thinking about its role in the world.
Thank you, Tom. And we will definitely come back to those issues. I think looking at the MENA region specifically, it's very pertinent to review not just sort of a real-time kind of snapshot now, but also the last sort of, I would say, maybe 30, 40 years of that kind of policy. I want to fast forward in time and also bring in Michael and ask about how, broadly speaking, how might, or how, Michael, do you view America's promotion of democracy abroad in light of the domestic crises that we've seen in the last 6 months, the Capitol insurrection on January 6th, but also the questioning of the legitimacy of the elections, the quote unquote big lie that people, supporters of President Trump, former President Trump, have themselves sort of supported?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's both a potential danger, obviously domestically, and for the health of the American polity. But I also think it presents some opportunities. And so I think much depends on what the United States does with this moment. So, clearly there has been democratic backsliding here in the United States. So for a country that purports to defend and espouse and promote these values on an international basis, that's obviously something of a problem, something of a contradiction. And clearly a lot of people have noted this recent failing, and it's garnered a lot of attention. And of course, it's part of a broader depression in terms of democratic norms more broadly. And so clearly, I think, a Trump administration was not in a particularly strong place to promote these values, and I don't think took those values seriously in their own conception of what the United States should be doing in the world. So obviously it has tarnished the American reputation, but of course, a lot has tarnished the American reputation on this set of issues previously, right? So it is not unbesmirched and simply a Trump era phenomenon. But what I also clearly see is that there is opportunity. And I think that depends, one, on American transparency, the way that the United States talks about these issues, promoting and enhancing a democratic political culture is hard. It is a struggle, even in countries in which we believe these issues had long been settled. I think if the United States is honest about that and acknowledges the difficulties of persevering, of maintaining democratic political culture, and of course, much depends not just on the transparency about these issues and current American difficulties, but in repair, right? I mean, it's one thing to acknowledge that there has been this democratic backsliding, that we understand how that has been perceived both internally and abroad, and that we need to do more collectively as a society to repair that damage. But of course, you have to repair that damage, right? So I think a lot of people are throughout the world, still looking to see what happens next. I think, the Biden election clearly was important in that progression. But obviously, you mentioned the big lie. There's a lot happening. There are some countervailing pressures at the moment. And how the United States deals with all of that will go a long way in terms of cementing how people abroad view the United States and view the United States as a credible actor or not on this set of issues.
Before I move to my sort of very quickly as a follow-up, in Europe, we've been having this discussion probably, for a long time before the US in terms of modern, recent discussion on this rise of populism and the reasons behind it and why. And in Europe, the settled kind of idea is the financial crash of 08, 09 onwards, and then the rise in migration flows as a result of the wars, notably in Syria, but also Afghanistan and Iraq. Those kinds of immediate effects don't necessarily hit the US as hard as they do Europe, which borders the region specifically. So very quickly, and not asking you for a definitive answer, but if you were to try and analyze this quote unquote rise in populism in the United States, would it be the same reasoning? Are there specific unique reasons in the US that we've seen either reflected in the Trump administration or thereafter with this questioning of legitimacy of the electoral process, etc.? What would be your reasoning behind that?
It's a pretty big question.
Yeah,
I think, one thing that marks the United States differently than Europe, and of course, I do think the financial crisis is a big part of this story. But I think the reaction to 9/11, the so-called global war on terrorism, the Iraq war, have had a very corrosive effect on respect for democratic norms. I think there's been a lot of oftentimes unrecognized spillover in the ways in which, effectively, almost 2 decades of constant war making has had on American society and American democracy. So I think that's one thing that I think is different in the context of the United States. I think obviously the financial crisis, I think they're exacerbating things like developments like the rise of ISIS and terrorism in the United States. There are different kinds of pressures in a changing, more heterogeneous, diverse society. So I think there are things that distinguish the United States, but I think more than anything else, I think it is that response to 9/11 that has created different kinds of pressures on democracy in the United States than perhaps in Europe.
Thank you. And that actually segues really well into the kind of next set of questions that I'd like to bring Maya in. I want to ask all three of you this, but starting with Maya. Maya, we've talked a lot about, or we do in the development space, in the foreign policy space, we talk a lot about the democracy promotion toolkit, the mechanisms, this idea of values and principles, this supporting of democratization across the world. And over the last kind of 5 or 10 years or so, I wouldn't want to say as a result of the Arab Spring or what's happened in the region, but certainly timing wise, coupled with it, is this approach in Europe and in the US that this idea, this democracy promotion foreign policy has failed. For some people from the region, they view this in line of the Bush era attempt to promote values, and then the following up with the invasion into Iraq and so on and so forth, and then what we've seen thereafter. So starting with you, but to all of you, briefly, how would you define that agenda specifically? Is it a values-based agenda for you? Is it about the kind of mechanisms, the follow-up support, the principles? What exactly is it for you that defines this agenda in terms of the United States' foreign policy?
Thanks so much, Hafsa. It's really great to be here and to speak alongside such great colleagues. Since I'm not covering US foreign policy specifically, and since that's not kind of my purview, but I have been based in the Middle East for most of the last decade, I'll try to answer from the perspective of the individuals, the officials, the NGO members, et cetera, the other people that I've been interviewing from across the region for the past 8 years. And I think it really depends on the country. I think it depends on, if you're looking at Lebanon, Syria, or Iraq, which are 3 countries that I've covered over this time, you see kind of different sort of initiatives that are being led, some that are focusing on capacity building with ministries, some that are focusing on promotion of media outlets, some that are focusing on election turnout and that kind of pathway towards governance. So you're looking at different kinds of initiatives across different countries, and that's why I think it's quite hard to measure the success or failure kind of based on one set of metrics, because they look different based on each one of those countries and where they are. I think that, in Lebanon, if you look at capacity building of institutions, if you look at elections, if you look at support to media outlets, as priorities for the US over the past couple of years, and you look at where the country is now, I think we can say that there's a lot missing. There's a huge gap in where the US was hoping those institutions would be and where they are now. The same goes for Iraq as well. Obviously, it was a different kind of democracy agenda there, very drastic change to the regime there, but we see the same kind of failure to build up the institutions. So I think it very much depends on what country we're talking about, how much money has been poured in, and how you want to measure the institutions improving or not improving in each country.
So Maya, just to kind of, I guess, not push a little, but kind of try and look at it in a different way, would you then view the agenda as being sort of the development support, the idea of building that infrastructure to support democracy, rather than, sometimes we talk a lot about changing the hearts and minds and how that we infuse those values. So would you say it's more materially seen in the kind of infrastructure support rather than this values approach that we hear a lot about and I would argue, don't really understand what it means? I'm putting words in your mouth, I know.
No, it's okay. No, I think in my kind of understanding of how it's been rolled out across the countries that I've covered, which again, Lebanon, Iraq, a little bit of Syria, and we can talk about kind of the democracy agenda in Syria as well, which is interesting. That it's about capacity building and it's about institutions. And through those institutions, the US is hoping that the values that it wants to promote are going to then become ingrained in that country. So in terms of changing hearts and minds, again, we can kind of dive into this a little bit later on, but a brief example. I mean, in Iraq and in Lebanon, there's a lot of it's a negative association if you're perceived to be taking in funding from the US. So for many civil society actors, for many activists, again, it's really unfortunate, but to point out the example of Diham Yaoub, who last year, she was an activist based in Basra. Last year, she visited a few years ago, she visited the American consulate and she was killed in Basra last year because of her perceived association with the US consulate there. So unfortunately, I think if we're going to grade, on changing hearts and minds, there's unfortunately a negative perception that comes with being associated with US funding or with a US agenda.
I completely echo that. I mean, having worked in civil society in the region for a decade at least, it comes now as a disclaimer to some NGOs where they explicitly state, we do not accept US foreign funding. I want us to jump into the region itself, but just to give Tom and Michael the chance to come in on this, very quickly, sort of briefly to each of you, kind of a minute each, like how would you define the democracy promotion agenda? And do you concur that it has failed if we look at the most recent sort of 10, 15 years of foreign policy in the countries it matters most? Tom, first to you.
Big question. I think the way we should look at it is that in the 1990s, the United States began to try to integrate support for democracy into its foreign policy around the world. It was only one of a number of priorities. It was not the dominant priority, but it was part of it, whether it was in Indonesia, in Nigeria, in Poland, or elsewhere. Then something big happened, which was 9/11, and the Bush administration gravitated towards the idea of invading Iraq and then trying to tell the world that the Iraq invasion was not just about security, but was actually a democratizing mission. And this was part of a new conception the United States had in the Middle East, which was that by supporting democracy, the United States would undercut the roots of Islamic radicalism. And so suddenly there was a new, very specific, quote, project in the Middle East, which was quite different from in the rest of the world, the sort of much wider and more general democracy promotion as part of US foreign policy, because it was more military driven and because it was more clearly related to a strategic interest of the United States, which was countering terrorism. And then this became obviously, a source of tremendous controversy in the Middle East, a tremendous amount of anger and hostility about this agenda. It ran into all the problems that it did in Iraq. And then the Bush administration did not really push very hard on democracy in the other countries during those years. Egypt got a bit of a nudge from the Bush people in 2004, 5, 6, but not that much of a nudge. And the other countries a little bit, but it wasn't really pursued in a very serious way. The relations of the Gulf states to the Bush administration continued to be friendly and so forth. Then the Obama people came in, tried to back away from the regime change, military-oriented approach and say, let's have a more normal, just support democracy in softer ways. But then they were hit by the Arab Spring and the Arab world, and the world said, so what's the United States going to do here? But that was an Arab-driven event. But then the question is, would the United States try to support it? It did in some ways, but again, it was a rather half-hearted support. The Gulf states still enjoyed very friendly relations with Washington, despite their opposition to the Arab Spring generally. And when Egypt had the coup in 2013, the United States was fairly ginger in its criticism of the Egyptian government about that. And so even Obama had trouble articulating a consistent kind of softer approach to democracy. So the Middle East has had a very particular experience with the larger issue of how the United States goes about trying to support democracy in the world, and a very problematic one in significant part, both because the United States got off on the wrong foot and did some bad things in the agenda with the militarization, but also because the region has struggled so much with its own efforts towards democratic change. It's been very hard for the United States to play a helpful supporting role in a region which is really stuck with a lot of bad and anti-democratic governments.
Thank you. And Michael, kind of the same question to you, but also adding into that, we are 6 months into, or almost 6 months into, a new administration. And, you know, Secretary of State Blinken has talked a lot about his values agenda, this idea of the US returning to the protection of human rights, the promotion of these kind of these freedom principles of fundamental freedoms, etc. So in light of what Tom said, and also what Maya said, particularly from the region, how would you situate the Blinken values agenda, as we call it today, with the track record the US has had?
Yeah, and I think Tom raises several really important points in terms of instrumentalization and selective engagement that obviously give rise to charges of hypocrisy. And of course, the mix of interests. I mean, there are, I would say, democracy and governance is a interest among many, and often loses out in the kind of discussion about how best to promote U.S. national security interests. And we're seeing that play out again. So we saw a lot of emphasis on a kind of shift in rhetoric, kind of bright line to distinguish this incoming and then new Biden administration from the Trump years when the United States was seen as overly and obsequiously, attached to authoritarian allies. But of course, how you do that in practice is always very difficult, partly because it's difficult to democratize, right? I mean, we do run up against unrealistic expectations, right? So democratization in Egypt is hard. It's not a kind of thing that the United States can simply produce, right? I mean, we see here domestically how difficult it is in the United States to maintain democracy. So, on one side we have, rhetoric. On another, we have, I think, unrealistic expectations at times. And then, of course, we have inconsistent application. And so, we're in a kind of moment when we're trying to decipher if the change in rhetoric means much. So, Joe Biden is not going to call Abdel Fattah al-Sisi on the telephone, but does that mean anything for U.S.-Egypt relations? And I think that's a different question. And so, I don't know what, I think the United States has a soft preference, genuinely, for democratic governance. I don't think it is pure cynicism, but the way that plays out through a foreign policy and interagency process in which it is one interest among many, that's an open question. And for this administration, I think, we've seen a lot of pressure to kind of revert back to some kind of status quo ante. I don't think that's possible, but that's clearly where we are now. I think, it is to be determined how these issues will play out in a Biden administration.
And so challenging you a little bit on that, Michael, obviously we are, what is it now, 10 days, 2 weeks into the most recent flare-up, conflict, war, clashes, whatever words you want to use, in Israel and within the occupied Palestinian territories. You've used the words the preference for democratization, but you've also used the word hypocrisy in the same kind of breath. And Tom mentioned for that part that 9/11 was really the watershed moment. Certainly, I would argue, and I think we would all understand that from the region, for different generations, that has been shaped by events in the Holy Land, Israel, and within the Palestinian territories. If we look at it now, I mean, let's maybe being unkind to the Biden administration, but being as harsh as we can be, to try and analyze this foreign policy agenda, this preference for democratization, or this quote unquote hypocrisy, how is that viewed in terms of the US's support to Israel? It's blocked 3 resolutions at the UN Security Council on the recent fighting. Dozens of people, including children, are dead, hundreds even, and the forced displacement of Palestinians continues, so on and so forth. So how do you square that circle?
Well, you don't. There's no squaring it. And so obviously for the Arab world, in some ways, modern Arab identity was formed in the period of decolonization, in which the question of Palestine and the fate of Palestinians was a central, not just political issue, but a question of identity in many ways. And so it has always been, to a perhaps lessening degree in recent years, a prism through which the region viewed the fairness of the international system. And I think it doesn't play the central role that it did when it was the kind of centerpiece of a programmatic politics of Arab nationalism. But it's important for a lot of people still. And it has always been a liability for the United States in its relations with the Arab world, because the United States plays a biased role. And there's no reason to equivocate about that. And so, we see many of the contradictions that of the United States' role in the world sort of, distilled in how the United States has approached the question of Palestine. And it's an inconvenient one for a Biden administration that is really focused on, a post-pandemic economic recovery, a kind of democratic recovery at home, and to the extent that there is an international agenda, the hopes were that it was not going to be focused on the Middle East. So it is, a tragedy, but also a somewhat, a detour from where the Biden administration wants to be. But of course, it has come. These wars in Gaza always recur, and it casts a harsh light on the U.S. position, particularly at a moment when the United States is trying to pivot and to suggest that it is taking a different approach from the Trump administration. It's a very uncomfortable, awkward, and hypocritical position to be in. There's just no two ways around that.
Maya, I kind of I'd ask you to respond to Michael. Kind of, you're in Beirut, you're in the region, and I think for a lot of us who are either here regularly or permanently based or visit regularly, at least I am constantly caught between this question of how much does the Palestinian cause still really resonate with people, ordinary people, whether it's our grandparents or our parents, and the US's role by extension. And not necessarily asking you to specifically focus on the Palestinian issue, but the perception, the role the US has played in this region, whether recently or whether historically it still impacts. How is the US perceived? I mean, is it still a question of the support to Israel defines how the US is perceived? You've been in Iraq and Syria for much of the last decade. Is it the Iraq invasion? Is it some would argue, the inadequate response in Syria? Is it different things? Is it all of those things combined? Is it all negative? Is it always negative? How would you, the floor is yours, whatever country, whatever angle or lens, to look at this idea of US perception, or the perception of the US, I should say.
Thanks so much, Hafsa. It's a very, very tricky question to answer. And I would hesitate also to kind of offer a man or a woman on the Arab Street perspective, because it really remains so diverse. Again, as I mentioned in my preliminary comments, it really depends on what country we're talking about, because each one of those countries is in a different place. Lebanon is somewhere, Iraq is somewhere else, Syria somewhere else, Egypt, etc., somewhere else. The Gulf is somewhere completely different, and U.S. engagement in each one of those countries has been quite different. I think if we are to look at the Palestinian conflict as a kind of overarching regional issue that is being followed kind of across the region, I would say that perceptions of the U.S. tend to be expressed much more unfavorably when there is a flare-up. But I haven't seen, at least in my reporting over the last 8 years, that when people talk about the US, when there isn't a flare up, that they're linking it to kind of to the Palestinian conflict. They very much focus on kind of what's going on in their own country and how the US has engaged in their own country. The material support, military to military relationships, things like that. So they very much focus on kind of that domestic engagement as opposed to the issue of Israel. Obviously, right now it's a different context. Kind of the entire region is watching this very, very, very closely. But I will say, kind of to Thomas's point earlier, what was the turning point? Was it 9/11 or was it the Arab Spring, which he had brought up, which I think is an excellent point. I think the idea that the U.S. is hypocritical, or maybe even a softer word is inconsistent in its approach to the region, I think was really born out of that moment a decade ago. And this perception that while the US says one thing, it's willing, it's willing to talk the talk, but is it really willing to walk the walk? Is it willing to pour resources, to be consistent in those resources, to see its interests, or to see democracy kind of installed? And I think that's a really interesting point of debate, but I wanted to stress kind of that particular moment as a turning point in perception for much of the region. And kind of it's really hard to separate also, how they perceive, how the region perceives the US separate from its institutions. I think we probably have a couple of questions coming up later on about specific institutions in the US, specific moments where people have been disappointed, where people have kind of felt that they've seen kind of an ugly face, the ugly face of the US. So we can talk about those moments later on. I mean, overall, I would say that the US is certainly still perceived as extremely powerful, but flawed in its own institutions, and also even in its democracy promotion across the region.
And Maya, do you feel that domestic events in the US resonate in the region beyond, I mean, we all like to try and again, not asking you to do the Thomas Friedman taxi driver kind of thing, but sort of look at, generally speaking, we as invested people, be us, dual citizens of countries in the West and the region, living between two, etc. We always have an eye on these events, but, how much beyond maybe changes of administration does it resonate? Do incidents like, maybe like the Capitol insurrection or like the killing of George Floyd, this issue of racial injustice? And, my question afterwards to the other speakers is going to be how that resonates with governments in the region and how they respond to the United States. But to ordinary citizens, do these domestic events resonate? Does it change the perception of the US? Is the US then viewed as powerful but flawed, but also challenged and threatened? Or, not to put again words in your mouth, sometimes I get the sentiment from people that this is America's comeuppance. Things like Trump, things like these protests, things like this question in defense of the way the US has behaved across the world in recent years.
Yeah, so I will say it's I'll kind of draw on a couple of different examples. I think first, if based on the example that you gave on the George Floyd inspired protests and the Black Lives Matter movement in general, I think, I was in Iraq at the time. I was actually, when the first kind of round of protests over Ferguson happened, I was based in Lebanon, and then I was in Iraq over the last 2 years. So obviously during kind of the swell last year, I was there. And it really seemed to me, again, based on what Iraqis were telling me, that there was this chip now, like this little, the chipped away at the kind of picture that they had of the U.S. as this fair, functioning country. And they were really shocked to see that, there is an issue with race relations in the U.S. That the police force there may not be, as fair as they had expected. So there was definitely a shift in perception. I couldn't tell you, is that going to last for the next couple of years? Is that kind of a permanent shift? Are we going to see, is that really going to matter to the US at some point? No, but just in terms of the anecdotal, the conversations that I had with Iraqis at the time. The other issues, there was the election, of course. And I think, every time I'm in the Middle East during an election, it's a really funny experience. In 2016, I was on my way to Mosul when Trump was elected, and then last year I was in Baghdad, and the first question I get is, what is the Electoral College? How does that work? How is that fair? So often it's that first question is about an institution. Is people in the Middle East trying to understand how this institution works when they understand the U.S. is very much elections are extremely important to its functioning. They don't understand how such a complicated institution can elect a president. So I think that that's been consistently a source of confusion, but especially last year, I think after we saw all of these challenges, all of these appeals, these questions about vote counts, et cetera. Again, another chip in the image of the U.S. where people were thinking, are these elections really as fair as they say? But we see different people challenging these vote counts, et cetera. And just the final example that I will give, because it has a specific kind of impact or a specific tie to the region. I was also in Baghdad last year, or earlier this year, when Trump pardoned 4 Blackwater guards for their involvement in the 2007 shooting spree on Nusra Square. Mm-hmm. And that obviously, I think, did the most damage to the U.S. perception, or the perception of the U.S. in the Middle East, because not just because it was Trump, but I had spoken during my reporting, I'd spoken to the chief Iraqi investigator who had worked with U.S. investigators, as they were carrying out their probe in Iraq. And he told me that he was very much disappointed, but not at all surprised, because he'd been seeing their sentences also just be reduced over the course of time. And he told me that he knew one day they would be let out of jail. So while there was a specific moment where people felt that the U.S. institutions were not as fair or as just as they had expected, there's also a perception that, for those watching quite closely, that it is accumulated, and it's not just because of Trump, but it's because perhaps there are flaws in those institutions that have been played out over time.
Thank you. And Michael, kind of building on that, in terms of how governments in the region perceive the US. I mean, we joke a lot, and we've seen it all on social media, how governments will quote unquote troll the US, in its moments of difficulty, be it protests, be it difficult institutional moments of crisis and so on. How do you think, either in light of immediate events or maybe the accumulation, as Maya mentioned, that the US is perceived by governments in the region, be it authoritarian regimes like in Egypt and in Syria otherwise, or something a bit messier like what's happened in Iraq and Lebanon?
Yeah, I mean, what I think in one sense, there's more predictability, right? I mean, there is a degree of competence and predictability that wasn't there during what's been a kind of tumultuous, erratic few years under Donald Trump, in which major government announcements would be made on Twitter, right? Mm-hmm. So I think there's a sense that we're going back to a kind of normal course of government and decision making, which I think is. Sorry about that, which I think is very useful. But I also think we're in a period when authoritarian leaders, at least in the region, are trying to understand what does this mean? Mm-hmm. We've heard a lot of rhetoric. Is this going to be matched by actions? And I think for many of them, the sense now is that, we can we can do business. If you're Egypt, you were probably quite concerned. There were internal discussions about trying to, perhaps mend fences, kind of face saving measures that could be taken. And of course, now you find yourself several months in, and it looks like, a kind of administration that you understand and know, and you can do business with, even if it is under strained conditions. So, I think we're still in that early phase. There's not a assistant secretary yet at MEA. I mean, there are a lot of slots that haven't been filled. There's no ambassador to Israel. So I wouldn't say that this is a normally functioning administration yet, but I do think there is a greater sense that, governments in the region at least understand what's going on.
And Tom, would you, I mean, if we're looking at the sort of concurrent crises that the US has been through domestically, do you agree that we're sort of, I wouldn't quote Michael as saying we're back to a more coherent functioning or something that we know better, but do you see foreign policy going back to a standard either set by the Obama administration or predecessors before that, and the Trump years were maybe a bit of a blip? Or how is, I guess the question is, how is the domestic situation in the US post-Trump, post these moments of crisis, be it a social issue, economic or political, constitutional even, how do you think they will affect sort of foreign policy? And we do have some specific questions about right now, but just broadly speaking, do you see the agenda shifting greatly?
Mm-hmm. There's a great striving on the part of the Biden team to return the United States to what it views as kind of normality, predictability, rationality, and a kind of return to less personalistic behavior abroad and so forth. But there's some deeper currents. One is that the events in the United States in the last year, the quest for racial justice, as well as the rise of right-wing extremism, which exploded on January 6th, are changing certain dynamics. We see this even in the Israeli-Palestinian issue, where some parts of the Democratic Party are connecting the struggle for racial justice at home in the United States to the struggle of Palestinians, and asking President Biden and his team and saying, if you believe in racial justice at home, why don't you believe in sort of justice and fairness with respect to Israel and Palestine? And that voice has risen in the last 6 months as a result of the connection of that issue. But a deeper question, which I think the Arab world and many other parts of the world are asking, is we see the striving for the return to, quote, normal America, but we also see your country is really deadlocked. 70% of American voters don't view Biden as having been legitimately elected. The kind of people who are likely to be an opponent to the Democrats in both 2022 legislative elections and the 24 presidential elections are likely to be quite Trumpist and have a chance of winning, certainly of gaining control of the House potentially, and winning the White House in 2024. And so people say, are you, is this temporary normality? Isn't your country really stuck in a kind of a very polarized deadlock in which, it's not clear who's going to win? And it may be that you're entering into a sustained period of a much harsher alternation of power, in which the alternation of power has a much greater effect on foreign policy than it used to. Used to be, to the extent there was alternation of ideology, it affected domestic policy much more. But Trump brought it all together so that there might be a greater lurching on the foreign policy thing. We saw that first when he backed out of the Iran nuclear deal. Just to tear apart a deal like that, to describe it in the extreme terms that he did as the worst deal in history, after it had been painstakingly negotiated with participation of the Europeans, the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, other Arab powers, to just tear that apart and walk away was a sign that foreign policy is now going to lurch in a way that it hasn't before. So I think there's clearly a striving for normality and some achievement of it, but it's on a very fragile foundation, with that foundation being cracked by the polarization that afflicts the United States.
that sort of segues into the sort of last couple of questions. We've got about 8 minutes before I want to take some of the questions that we've already received. A reminder to those of you on Zoom, if you'd like to submit a question, please use the Q&A box and make sure to list your name and country so we can identify you. But segueing that, we've talked a lot about the US domestically, its trajectory, how it has changed. The reality, of course, that the rest of the world has changed as well. And we are not necessarily looking at a Middle East region or even a geopolitical space that is the same as pre the culmination of these incidents in the US that have affected it so much domestically. We've got not just the rise of the powers such as Turkey, Iran, Israel, different balances now with the Gulf countries if we're looking at MENA, but also the expansionism of China, Russia's hardline stance in protecting and supporting the Syrian regime of Bashar al-Assad, and how that has projected a Russian foreign policy for the region, etc., etc. So to all three of you, starting with Maya from the region, to ask you about how do you think the US is or should be viewed in light of this plethora of new actors that may not have equal weight to the US and its long-standing position in the region, but certainly are very quickly, one would argue, catching up to match the US, and how what can the US, what should the US, do you think, do in order to either emerge as the values partner for this region, or maybe even more basically just counter the rise of these less democratic, more unconditionally supportive countries?
It's a great question. I think it's also worth even bringing in some of the actors that are not necessarily seen as rivals to the US, but actors like the EU or other European countries who are also doing their own kind of democracy promotion, or at least their institution building, etc. What I've heard again from civil society actors who are based in Iraq or based in Lebanon, from activists, they find it less politically thorny to get support from a country that is not the US. So maybe to look at the EU or to look at a UN organization, or to look at some kind of a support system that is not strictly US funding. That's one. And two, they find that support, at least again, how they represent it to me or how they describe it to me, they find that support is often more consistent. So they're not afraid of it being, it's not perceived as being, at least, this is for 4 years and then who knows what's going to happen after the next election. And three, they find it as less tied to, this is kind of related to the second point, but they find support from other countries, and the EU in particular, less tied to political objectives. So they are more comfortable taking on support from other countries. I think the US institution that probably has the best kind of track record and relationship building in the countries that I've been in so far is the military. So I think that's why it's a really interesting point, going back to what Tom was saying earlier about the kind of militarization that was happening at the same time as that democracy promotion agenda. There's very good relationships with the military, I think, because it is often very technical, very practical, mechanical, etc. And so there's less of a tension there. When it comes to rivals, US rivals, Russia, China, etc. Again, what I've heard from not just in this case civil society leaders, but also even business leaders and other people looking to work in the region or looking to get investments in the region is, again, those countries have less of, especially China, have less of a political agenda to their support, and so they don't have political strings attached, as some of the people that I interviewed in Iraq were saying. So there is, unfortunately, this perception that the democratic actor, or the most kind of vocally democratic actor among this kind of array of potential partners, for local actors, that democratic actor, the US, is the least reliable, the least consistent. So there's a kind of a relationship problem there, at least a public perception there. I'm not sure if that kind of gets your question, but it shaped the bit.
No, it does. And I kind of want to take that and ask Michael if, taking Maya's comments, if the US's backbone of its support, its democracy promotion, its financial support, its support to civil society, the elevation of civil society, if that is now becoming something that is viewed as detrimental or unreliable for partners on the ground, coupled with the fact that governments, one would argue or might argue, could argue, are shifting or at least entertaining support and engagement with other actors that, you know, some are American adversaries, others are simply just not in line with the agenda fully. Where does that leave US policy in the region? You know, are we just talking about, you know, a theater of actors that are all trying to grab their own piece? Does the US still have that prestige as the world superpower to be able to come in, as Tom said, reset the agenda post-Trump and go back to normal?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a mistake for the United States to look at the region in that kind of zero-sum, almost Cold War way. You know, China is not a regional player like the United States. It's just not. They're not even engaging in security hedging to any real extent. That tells you a little bit about how they understand the US presence, particularly when they are one of the countries most dependent on oil flows out of the region, right? Clearly, the Chinese do not believe that the United States is retrenching, or else they would be behaving quite differently than they are now. And Egypt wants to use Russia and relations with Russia and perhaps China as a hedge to try to rebalance relations with the United States. And to an extent, I sort of shrug my shoulders. Like, I don't think it's that big a deal. And I think if we construct, if the United States constructs a regional policy based on the sense of this kind of zero-sum competition, I think it will lead to some perverse ends. And quickly, because I know I don't want to take up too much time on this bit, but I'm surprised the extent to which regional countries still look to the United States. At some level, I would have assumed that credibility would have evaporated for a good number of reasons. And yet, people in the region really do care what the United States thinks. That's true. And it remains true. I'm slightly surprised at times why that's the case. But it clearly bespeaks something broader about the role of the United States. The United States this is not the unipolar moment of the 1990s, but the United States still plays a very important role in the region. And Russia and China are not going to fill that role. They're just not, and they're not in a position to. And I think the United States shouldn't, base and structure its role in the region based on that kind of sense of competition.
Thank you. That was kind of like a throwing a bomb into the entire discussion, and now shifting things to whether, how countries respond. But I want to give Tom an opportunity to respond to the same question, and then we'll move to the audience's questions to make sure that we have time for that. So Tom, please.
Well, I'll be really brief. In many of the most important conflicts in the region in the last 10 years, the United States has been a bystander in Syria, in Libya recently, and to some extent in Yemen. And it's really startling to watch, the fate of Libya being determined by Turkey, Russia, the United Arab Emirates, and others, and Libyans. And the United States really, especially during the Trump years, kind of a haphazard bystander. But I guess I'd sum it up, with a, sort of the contradiction of an Egyptian friend of mine, said recently, she'd been, watching U.S. move to the sidelines on many issues in the Middle East. She says, I spent most of my adult life being furious at the United States for its hypocrisy and its, all of the things it did, in her view, wrongly in Egypt. And now I find myself furious that you're on the sidelines, because at some level I still had hopes that you would do something useful in our country, because deep down, at least you always say you really care about these issues, whereas Russia, Turkey, etc., obviously Iran obviously don't. So there's a great contradiction, I think, on the part. I can't speak for the Arab point of view directly, but I think more than a few Arabs have felt very conflicted about the U.S. role, very angry about it for good reasons, but also are not necessarily happy if the United States checks out and says, well, you're kind of on your own. And others are going to determine your fate, or you're going to have to figure it out yourselves. We're just not really that in the game anymore. That's going to be unsettling to some people.
Clearly, absolutely, I can imagine. We're going to move to the audience's questions, sorry. So we've got a range of questions, both on the question of US democracy, but also on the region. And it's no surprise that a lot of the questions on the region are focusing on current events in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. So I'll start more with the democratization or the democracy question, sorry, for the US, for both Tom and Michael. This question from Ming Chu in the US. Apologies already for failure to correctly pronounce any names. They asked, to what extent is the flag of democracy better raised or spread by a collection of democracies such as the likes of Sweden, South Korea, Canada, Australia, arguably with superior democracy implementations, direct vote, no electoral college, examples of many political parties in the legislature, not the two-party system the US has, less minority rule, arguably a lesser focus on gerrymandering and so on. Michael, I'll pose that to you because there's another question linked to that is directed at Tom specifically.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to have lots of people and lots of countries, pursuing this agenda and pursuing it consistently. Maybe in specific ways, like touching on what Maya has mentioned previously. I think there is useful division of labor at times in terms of how the United States should coordinate with other partners and allies in terms of funding civil society, right? I mean, there are times when this should be coordinated directly. But again, it's not an either or. It is not, the US stands back and lets Sweden take over, right? The way in which this can be done productively, I think, is if it is done in concert with other like-minded allies and partners. So,
but if I can step in and sort of not challenge that, but we've been looking and we engage in the diplomatic space in the region for all different kinds of reasons, and there is a reality, no matter how much one can say civil society groups don't like US funding and prefer European funding. When it comes to the fundamentals, the messaging, the diplomatic relations, the bilateral stuff, everybody still looks to the US. It's not an equal kind of, it's not an either or, and you're right, but at the same time, it's not that any other country specifically can take on the mantle of the size that the US occupies in that space. So
you answered the question for me. So yes. Yeah, I agree. That's right. But it was posed as, shouldn't these other countries do the job? And of course, I don't necessarily agree with that.
Okay, fair enough. And Tom, a question directly for you from Anne Moisen, who I understand is also in the United States. Again, apologies for pronunciation. Asking, while the focus is on US democracy, there is a parallel discussion ongoing in EU capitals on the critical need for re-democratizing democracies more broadly across the world. How will or should that impact US foreign policy going forward?
Very good question. You're right. The old idea that there's a zone of countries in the world that are established democracies and basically have their democratic problems solved, and there's another bigger zone of new and struggling democracies is gone. We now have the reality that democracies all over the world are struggling, and they're struggling with fairly similar things in many cases. Above all, they're struggling with two big things, which is the feeling citizens have that their interests are being represented, the sense of inclusion and representation, and then secondly, the quest for accountability, the sense that power holders really have to answer to citizens, not just represent, but follow the law, do what they say they'll do, carry out the policies they're supposed to. And this is universal. Donald Trump was a product of many people feeling they were being pushed aside, that the government wasn't being accountable to them and so forth. But so did voters in South Korea who pushed out the president, not long ago and put in a different president. And so there is a common quest. And so it's critical that American democracy promotion unify and sort of have a sense that, democracy is a mutual learning endeavor. We're working on it at home. We're struggling. You're struggling. Let's work together on this. We're polarized. You're polarized. Let's get together and talk about methods of overcoming or managing polarization. And the same with the EU. The EU has to incorporate into its policies a sense that no, the EU doesn't have all the answers, but it has a common quest. It has some resources, some experience. So let's be partners in this. There has to be a new sense of solidarity and mutuality in this domain. The old idea that we're bringing something to you, that's just gone. It has no credibility anymore. It has to be. We have to work on this together because look what the alternative is. Do you want the Xinjiang province? And see what they're doing to people there. You want exclusion and discrimination and not representation. That's not the alternative. You want Myanmar? You want to slaughter innocent people in the streets by the hundreds. Don't want that. So you don't want those things. So you may have doubts about democracy, but isn't that the path towards the representation and accountability that you so badly want? So the foreign policy has to really bridge with domestic policy, embody these values, but also a greater humility in how it approaches the democracy agenda and focus on these essential elements that is really what's driving people's quest for political change in so many different places.
Well, you both sort of segued in, but also answered partly a couple of questions we have, both on the same thread. One from Joe Jubeli, who is Lebanese American, and also Murhaf Jojati from the US, building on this question of the US's support or promotion even of authoritarian states in the region. And I want to ask all three of you, but start with Maya. Joe Jabeli asks, is Arab public opinion now in favor or more in favor of security and stability, that security and stability argument over freedom and liberty? And if so, is it now time for the US to effectively give up on the idea of democratizing the Arab world?
Thanks for the question. Full disclosure, he is my father, so I will answer it. There we go.
I was trying to be fair at the first question, I'm sorry.
No, I think just full disclosure is the best policy to go for always. So thanks for the question. Definitely something that I heard repeatedly in the region, especially from Syria. I mean, I was reporting on Syria for the better part of 5 years, and unfortunately, by the end of that 5 years, in the beginning, obviously there was a lot of hope. There was a lot of kind of a sense that there would be democratic institutions that could be installed, even locally in certain parts of Syria, especially with U.S. support. And by the end, obviously, following the chemical attacks, following the kind of the red line promise that there would be a response for those chemical attacks that never came, there was a perception that, many of these civil society activists or those living in opposition-held areas in Syria had been abandoned. Things only got worse after that. Their hometowns only, proceeded to get further and further destroyed, destabilized. Many of them fled. And so now when I talk to many of those same activists, it's with a really, really kind of heavy heart that a lot of them say, I just wish that I could live in Syria, because they've been displaced, even if that is the Syria of pre-2011. And again, anecdotally, I was quite disturbed in 2019 to hear, young Iraqis who were protesting in late 2019, early 2020, say, this system of governance in Iraq is not working, and maybe we need to go back to strongman rule. So again, anecdotally, I'm hearing that. I don't have poll data. I don't have something kind of, concrete that I can come to you with. But it is quite disturbing to hear those, and then to see also when you compare that to voter turnout in the region. When you compare, when you look at voter turnout in parliamentary elections in 2018 in Lebanon and Iraq, both of which are expected to have elections soon as well, and you see how low it is, in the 40% officially, with a lot of expectations that the number is even lower. And if youth are not engaging in those democratic institutions that gives you a sense of kind of where they're they're thinking about immigration, they're thinking there's no pathway for change in their own countries. Does that translate into, you know, a shift? Should that translate into a shift for the US? I'm going to pass on that question and hand it over to either Michael or Thomas, but just to give kind of the perception domestically from the region.
Well, I can certainly already imagine the dinner table conversations with your parents are fun as mine are. Michael, giving you that kind of question, if we do see a growing trend for, you know, we can interpret or we can put aside the fact that interpreting security and stability and what that means in the concept of democracy may not necessarily be as clear as some may think. But what does that leave for the US? You know, if you take Tom's comments about, you know, the need and the necessity to both focus domestically, but also promote that values agenda abroad, is it a case of just doing it regardless of the state of play in the region, and that's going to be the best thing forward, and that's what the US has to do because that's what the US is? Or is there a more pragmatic, realist, you know, not that I'm advocating it, of course, but this security, stability, you know, authoritarian regimes get the job done over freedom and liberty kind of argument to be made?
Well, I mean, to go back, you know, not to go off on too much of a tangent, but
I go for it.
we look back at the uprisings, you know, political ruptures are very dangerous and they're not controllable. And, you know, it is simply unrealistic to imagine that the United States can, you know, channel those uprisings to a safe place. You know, I think, you know, we can talk about sort of contributory negligence, to borrow a legal term, you know, but we have to look at agency of people in the region. Egypt's uprising didn't fail because of the United States. Egypt is not a democratic country today, not directly because of US actions. We can argue about contributory actions and contributory faults, but you know, if the region expects the United States to democratize the countries for them, they're going to be very disappointed. And I have a pretty limited view of American leverage. You know, you know, when President Obama suspended weapons sales to Egypt not after the coup, but after Rabaa, you know, I think it ruffled the feathers of a lot of Egyptians, but they certainly didn't change the course of their kind of thwarted transition. They wanted Apache helicopters, they wanted Hellfire missiles, but they certainly weren't going to change their behavior to get them. And so I think the United States should probably shift from thinking about leverage. Military aid is not a tool for political change and democratization, and perhaps think more about complicity, not about what the United States can force through, you know, modulation of its aid, particularly military assistance, but what it means to be associated with that kind of security assistance and aid relationship. So, you know, I don't think the United States can produce political outcomes in a place like Egypt. I don't think that's realistic. And, you know, but I do think the United States has to think long and hard about what it's supporting. And so moving away maybe from a model of leverage to thinking much more about complicity.
Mm-hmm. And Tom, kind of shifting to the very, very specific questions we have on the Israeli-Palestinian situation, two questions together from Abdul Kibsi, our moderator in the US, and Sarah Kurwani, I apologize, and sorry, in Canada, or Paris. I'm sorry, I don't know if she's in Montreal or Paris right now, but looking at trying to understand the Biden position on recent events and what that position means, maybe broadly for MENA foreign policy. Do you feel there's a palpable shift in support for the Palestinians within the Democratic Party? And if so, will that have an effect on broader support for a more democracy, human rights agenda in MENA? Will it change MENA foreign policy approach by the Biden administration? Or is the last 4 days and the blocking of resolutions at the UN more exampled of where the Biden administration will go regardless of the party?
happy to answer that, but I can't resist. I want to come back just to the issue
Yes, please,
Michael
go
and
for it.
I were just discussing.
I'm just making sure I
I
get
have
all
a
the questions in. So
no, of course. I have a slightly different view of the tension between stability and democracy. In the Middle East, I'm not a Middle East specialist. I'm a broader comparativist. The Middle East is really unusual politically for a variety of reasons, but here's one big reason. It's the region of the world that is, on the one hand, has the most active civil conflicts, often with international participation, a whole series of them. Yet then, on the other hand, has a whole series of extraordinarily stagnant political regimes. So you have a region which is defined by eruption and stagnancy. No other region has that dynamic quite so dramatically as the Arab world. And so I think we have to be careful to generalize to say Arabs are really leaning back now towards stability versus change. Depends where they are. If you're in Libya, of course you want stability. For goodness sakes, why wouldn't you? If you're in Syria, if you'd like the bombs to stop falling and you'd like to get back to some normal life. On the other hand, if you're in Algeria or Jordan or Lebanon or some of the places that had tremendously stagnant governance, you're angry. You're angry about corruption. You're angry about political overreach, in their demonstrations. And there's pent up desire for change. So it's a region which has these two powerful dynamics in it, which are very different from each other. And so therefore, US policy, if you say, should the United States support democratic change? Well, it depends. Supporting democratic change in Libya right now means one thing, which is, can this government stick, the new government, and can it be at least somewhat representative and pluralistic? Whereas in Algeria, democratic change would mean, some significant change in a system which is stuck and so forth. So I think we should be careful in that regard. Now, with respect to the question about the Biden position on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I would describe it as picture somebody who's standing somewhere. They've been standing there a long time, which is a pro-Israel position. And you watch them and say, are they changing? Are they moving? I would say the Biden's people's feet haven't changed. They're sort of leaning a little bit in the Palestinian direction, certainly more than Trump would have in such a situation. But I haven't seen their feet move yet. Their feet are still in vetoing UN resolutions, providing Israel the security assistance and diplomatic cover that it needs, and so forth. So they're leaning a bit. But U.S. policy, the roots of U.S. policy and the position it's taken towards this conflict now for decades are so deep and are so entrenched in our political system and in political representation in our Congress and in other things that it would take more than this conflict to really, I think, see a White House that would genuinely shift to a very different approach that would involve a much greater recognition of Palestinian rights and therefore some real consequences for Israel for its particular approach in the situation.
And Michael, to you as well, that same question, but in light of, there have been some suggestions that some members of Congress want to just review the US aid relationship with Israel. Obviously, Senator Bernie Sanders has been very outspoken in his desire to reassess the relationship. If, taking Tom and obviously come in and respond to that, but is the party changing to a way that would change or force change in the White House?
Well, so I'm going to respond to the first part of what Tom said as well, because I think it's important. The United States can't outpace Arab societies in terms of political change. But when there are opportunities, and we should mention Sudan here, there is a way to be proactive and, at least in incremental terms, help support those kinds of political transitions. And so, Sudan, Tunisia, other places are more ripe for U.S. and partners to engage in terms of supporting what is happening on the ground that is coming out of local agency, what people are doing. So, again, it is a big region. It is varied. Political contexts are different, and obviously, Sudan looks a whole lot different than Egypt, and that's a very good thing for the Sudanese. And on your question, yes, I think discourse in the United States has changed in recent years in terms of discussion of Israeli-Palestinian issues. I think it's unfortunate that it comes at a time when a two-state solution is effectively dead, has been dead for quite some time. And so, the avenues for engagement are, I think, on a longer time horizon. I do think the discussion of equal rights as a kind of agnostic approach to say end state less important than the fact that statelessness and dispossession cannot be the open-ended fate of Palestinians forever. I think those are good. Those are things that are gaining traction and currency. I think the kind of countervailing pressure is what is happening on the ground, and there are no kind of near-term political outcomes that are within reach. And so I think we have a change in discourse and a dramatically worse situation on the ground, which means that even if we have a very positive shift in the way the United States wants to engage with this issue, it is much more intractable. And I think we're looking at generational change and not the kind of work of a Biden administration.
One could be very cynical and say that, in fact, because things like the issue of the two-state solution is no longer physically viable, then there's less capital to be expended by showing support. But I will leave that for another day. I'm also overly cynical by nature. We've got a few minutes left, and trying to get something out of this discussion more than we already have, but maybe pushing you guys for some concrete recommendations or maybe issues to watch in terms of how US foreign policy will shape itself under this administration, be it because of domestic events that may influence that, or just the trajectory of this administration. What would your recommendations be, either, and you can choose either for the region in engaging with the US or for the United States as it engages with this region? And we'll start with Tom and then Maya and end with Michael.
The United States is potentially on the brink of a very major change in its Middle East policy as part of its larger pivot to Asia and to other parts of the world, in moving away from an over-securitized, over-military-oriented policy to the region for decades, towards a policy which recalibrates what U.S. interests really are in the region. And that could be a ticket for diminished influence and constraint. But although I think it's the right direction of U.S. policy, it could also be seen as a chance to finally change the balance of some of the democracy security contradictions in the past and actually give the United States more influence on democracy issues, because it'll be less constrained by some of those traditional security interests. I'm thinking particularly with Egypt, but also with some of the Gulf partners, which the United States has traditionally punted on democracy and rights issues for the sake of security relations. And so if the United States really begins to change the character of its engagement in the Middle East, and I recommend here a great compendium my colleagues Fred Wary and Michelle Dunn just published yesterday or today, that looks at the whole question of over-securitization of the U.S. role in the Middle East and how to change that, then I think this could be good news for democracy. It's not going to be a revolution. As Michael said, you can't get out ahead of where people are. At best, you can be a supporting partner, but the U.S. could ultimately be, and I think has the chance to be, a more helpful partner in some of the countries that are really stuck and those that are trying to move forward, like Tunisia.
Thank you. Maya, please.
I'm not in the business of making these kinds of recommendations, but I will say, kind of based on Tom's comments, that I think hopefully what we're going to see in the coming years in the region is a more realistic expectation of what the U.S. can contribute in terms of institution building, more consistency, of course, more balance and cooperation across the board with various partners, and I think, despite kind of the disappointments that we talked about a little bit, when it comes to regional civil society actors, I think that one good thing that can come out of this, and that's something that Michael touched on as well, is some more realistic expectations on what we can rely on the U.S. for, or what civil society actors can rely on the U.S. for. So kind of, in the best possible scenario, we'll just have a lot more balance and less disappointment across the board. But I think beyond that, I'm not going to make specific recommendations for any countries.
No, I completely endorse that personally, I think. And Michael, the last word is with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a great appetite for a kind of right sizing of US role, a kind of rebalancing of priorities, a reassessment of what the United States is doing and should be doing and wants to do in the region. I think there are exaggerated fears of a speedy American retrenchment. If we look at force posture, that tells us a very different story. I think diplomatic organs have withered particularly during the Trump years, and we have a kind of path-dependent military and overly militarized posture that has privileged military actors on the American side in the region. But so if you want to rebalance, there's a whole lot that has to go into it to make it successful. I think quick pullouts are destabilizing and are not going to be beneficial to the region. So, I think there has to be a broad effort at conflict resolution, particularly the conflicts the United States is a direct participant in. That's obviously much easier said than done. There has to be a kind of broad reassessment of military posture and security assistance. Tom mentioned that new Carnegie Endowment volume, which touches on these topics, and I'm very eager to have a read. And I would marry that with some very practical concerns, like political prisoners, to try at least to demonstrate a capacity to do, not structural change at a kind of level of governance, but to at least try to push partners in the region to free the many thousands of political prisoners and to kind of produce a tangible record of some success. I think that would be helpful. And of course, at a kind of individual level, there are people who have been languishing in jail unjustly for many years now. So, I think there is a kind of big picture strategic reassessment that has to happen in terms of the modalities of engagement and how the U.S. is interacting with its partners and enemies in the region. But I'd like to see that married with a kind of practical. My computer wants to crash. It keeps trying to crash. But a kind of practical agenda that can produce some tangible results, some wins, and I think that would be important.
Thank you all three of you for a phenomenally interesting discussion. I know I threw a lot of big questions that are themselves hour-long discussions on their own, and we tried to get through as much as we could. But I think that, I've certainly learned a lot. There's a lot to go away and think about, I think, for a lot of us who prioritize this issue and working with and alongside the United States to further goals, the values, the goals, the principles that we want to see in this region. It's been a decades-long fight, and it doesn't seem to be letting up anytime soon. Even the small wins are becoming harder and harder to come by. My thanks again to UCLA CMED for hosting us and for allowing us the space to have this conversation, to all of the participants, the attendees on Zoom, those watching live on YouTube. Thank you very much. Have a safe and wonderful evening, afternoon, weekend, and so forth. And stay safe and stay healthy to all. All the best. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for such an important presentation at such a critical time. On behalf of the CMED team, thanks to our moderator, Hafsa Halawa, and our esteemed panel for bringing such vital conversations to our community. This was a marvelous discussion. I know I learned a lot, and I'm sure that's true of all of you. And we certainly appreciate your willingness to answer the group's questions. Bravo. Even though the topics were tough, the discussions were rough, especially if you're an American. At any rate, I want to spend these last few seconds to talk about a new program for CMED that begins next Tuesday, May 25th at 10 a.m. Los Angeles time, and you have a little announcement about it before you now. It's going to be a monthly series called CMED Chats, where various moderators sit down with charismatic MENA figures to discuss a variety of topics. Different interviewers, different speakers. When I talk to Egyptian ambassador and many other posts, Hisham Yousaf, who has held so many positions in the quest to bring peace to the region and is so well known throughout the world in many ways, and was very popular when we asked some people, who would you like to start this program with? You don't want to miss this conversation. If you are interested in learning more, sign up for our mailing list shared on the screen in the right now. And I want to say that I'll be talking to a very intriguing figure about his illustrious career, but of course we will address the major issues, and particular issue of the moment. So looking forward to seeing you on Tuesday, and thank you for this wonderful and thought-provoking presentation, I think especially for Americans. Thank you all, and we'll be back soon. Bye-bye, everyone.